In a corporate world where power often corrupts, one boss crossed the line in the most shocking way imaginable. Imagine working tirelessly, giving your all, only to be dismissed with a cruel twist that left everyone in disbelief. This isn't just another story of workplace drama, this is the story of a fiery showdown between an unjust employer and an employee who refused to back down. As the boss delivers the devastating news, you can almost feel the tension in the room. But then, something completely unexpected happens. Instead of cowering or pleading, this employee takes a stand that no one saw coming. The room goes silent. But what happens next? You won't believe the response that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us as we unfold a tale of defiance, courage, and a fight against unfair treatment, one that will make you rethink the power dynamics in the workplace. Stay tuned for the twist that could change everything. As the boss's words echoed through the room, the weight of his dismissal hung in the air like a dark cloud. Everyone in the office, from the longtime employees to the fresh faces, froze for a moment. It wasn't the first time someone had been let go from the company, but there was something different about the way it happened this time. It wasn't just the firing, it was the coldness, the lack of humanity in the boss's tone, that stung. For a split second, you could see a flicker of disbelief in the employee's eyes, but then something shifted. The employee stood there, facing the desk, her back straight, shoulders squared, as if she were about to step into battle. No panic, no outburst, just a steady silence. Her colleagues exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect next. Some thought she might plead for her job, others braced themselves for a tearful goodbye. But what happened next? It was nothing anyone could have predicted. With a deep breath, the employee finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not firing me." The words were so simple, yet they carried a force that seemed to freeze time itself. The boss, already irritated by the defiance, scoffed. "I'm not asking for your permission. The decision's final. Pack your things and go." His tone was patronizing, dismissive, like he thought the matter was settled. But the employee wasn't backing down. The tension in the room grew thicker by the second, as everyone's attention turned to the unfolding standoff. The employee didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes locked on her boss's. In that moment, it wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about something bigger: dignity, fairness, respect. The boss was used to having all the power, to making decisions that affected the lives of his employees without any pushback. But now, here she was, challenging his authority in front of everyone, forcing him to see the humanity he so often ignored. But this wasn't just an isolated battle. The office was filled with other people who had, at one point or another, felt the sting of his cruelty. Some had been unfairly passed over for promotions, others had been subjected to microaggressions, and a few had been let go under questionable circumstances. This wasn't just about one person anymore, it was about a system that allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. The tension in the room was palpable, and it felt like everyone was waiting for the first spark to ignite the powder keg. And yet, the response from the boss was chilling in its indifference. "You don't have a choice," he said, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You think you can change things? This is how it works here. You can either leave now or leave later. The choice is yours." The smugness in his voice was almost unbearable. It was clear he didn't take her seriously, and maybe that was the most infuriating part. But the employee wasn't done yet. She took a step forward, her presence filling the room. "I'm not the only one you've hurt, am I?" she said, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable edge. "This is about more than just me losing my job. This is about the people you've pushed aside, belittled, and discarded like they don't matter. I'm not afraid of you anymore." She didn't raise her voice, but the intensity of her words was enough to send a ripple of shock through the room. Everyone was watching. Her colleagues, who had grown used to the toxic culture of the workplace, now found themselves caught in a dilemma. Some felt the sting of guilt for not speaking up sooner, others felt an odd sense of admiration. But no one expected what would happen next. The boss, realizing his usual tactics weren't working, leaned forward, his face reddening with irritation. "You're playing a dangerous game," he spat, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this. I can make sure you never work again. No one will hire you if you keep this up. Do you really want to go down this path?" But the employee didn't falter. "You think I'm scared of losing my job? You think I'm scared of your threats? You're not the only one with power here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. She had no idea where this was going, no certainty that she could win, but she knew she had to try. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for all the people who had been silenced for too long. At that moment, the room fell into an eerie silence. The clock ticked loudly in the background as everyone waited for the next move. The boss, caught off guard by her strength, seemed momentarily lost for words. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots, and now this employee was flipping the script in a way that no one had ever dared to before. But before anyone could speak, a voice cut through the tension. It came from one of the other employees, someone who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. "She's right," they said, their voice shaky at first, but gaining strength with each word. "You've done this to so many people. It's not just her. We're all tired of being treated like we don't matter." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that sent shockwaves through the room. Another voice joined in, then another. It wasn't just a single act of defiance anymore, it was a movement, small but growing, a collective push against the oppressive system that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The boss's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he scanned the room. He hadn't expected this. In all his years of making employees feel small and insignificant, he had never anticipated that they might rise up together. But now, the power dynamic was shifting, and it was becoming clear that the employee's decision to stand her ground had sparked something much bigger than anyone had realized. And yet, the boss wasn't ready to back down. With a forced chuckle, he stood up from his chair and straightened his jacket. "You think this is some kind of revolution?" he said, sneering. "You all think you can intimidate me? You're wrong. I'll bury this, just like I've buried everything else. You can all go down with her if you want, but it won't change anything. I'm in charge here." But as he spoke, the weight of his words seemed to lose their impact. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. It wasn't just about one employee anymore. It was about the collective courage that had been ignited in this moment. And in the midst of all the tension, the question lingered, who would break first? Would the boss find a way to squash this uprising? Or would the employees, united in their shared frustration, take the leap toward something bigger, something that might change the course of their futures forever? The employee stood there, unwavering, her eyes locked on the boss's. The tension was unbearable, the room holding its breath as both sides prepared for the next move. Would the boss show his true colors and fire everyone in the room just to prove a point? Or would the employees push back hard enough to force him into a corner? The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone, from the long-time employees to the fresh hires, waited for what was coming next. The boss, standing in front of his desk with a smug, almost threatening expression, tried to project an air of authority. His eyes scanned the room, but they no longer held the same unchallenged power they once had. There was something different now. Something had shifted. The employee who had stood up for herself, who had refused to be treated like a disposable cog in the machine, had sparked something in the others. That spark had quickly turned into a fire, and now the office was filled with a collective strength that hadn't been there before. The boss's face twisted into a scowl as he looked around, trying to gauge the loyalty of his employees. But what he didn't realize was that his reign of control had been built on fear, and fear only worked as long as there was no one to challenge it. Now, for the first time in what seemed like forever, that fear was being replaced with courage. He could feel it. The quiet murmurs, the defiant stares, the sense that things were changing. "I'm not afraid of you," the employee said again, her voice calm but strong. "And neither is anyone else here." Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge to everything the boss had come to believe about his power. The room was silent for a few long moments, the kind of silence that felt like it could shatter at any second. Finally, the boss broke the tension, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can win this? You think any of you can change the way things are around here? You're all just replaceable." But something had shifted. The employee didn't flinch. "We're not replaceable," she said simply. "Not anymore." For a brief moment, the boss looked like he was going to explode. But instead, something else happened. It wasn't the violent outburst everyone had expected. Instead, his shoulders slumped, just slightly, as though the weight of everything he had been holding up for so long was starting to crack. His facade of control seemed to falter, and for the first time, he was no longer certain of the outcome. Then, something unexpected occurred. One by one, employees began to step forward. It wasn't coordinated, but there was an undeniable energy in the air. The people who had silently endured his harsh words, the unfair promotions, the dismissals, all of them started to find their voices. Some had never imagined standing up before. Some had been afraid of losing their jobs, their livelihoods. But today, things felt different. A longtime employee, someone who had been with the company since its early days, spoke up. "You've been taking advantage of us for too long. It's not just about one person's job anymore, it's about all of us. We've been afraid to speak up because we thought we didn't have the power. But we do." Another employee, a newer hire who had been quiet up until this point, nodded. "We're tired of being treated like we don't matter. We're tired of working under constant pressure with no appreciation. It's not just her, you've hurt all of us in different ways. It's time for it to end." The boss, who had always seen himself as untouchable, seemed to shrink in the face of this wave of unity. His eyes darted nervously from one employee to the next, as if trying to figure out what had changed. But it was too late for him to control the narrative. The room was no longer filled with fear, it was filled with resolve. "You think we're going to just let you walk away unscathed?" The employee continued, her voice unwavering. "You think this is just about one person losing their job? We've had enough of your treatment. And we're not backing down." For the first time, the boss hesitated. His gaze flickered, his usual smugness replaced by uncertainty. He had always been the one calling the shots, pulling the strings, but now, in front of a united front of employees, he was suddenly aware of how fragile his position truly was. The silence stretched on, broken only by the quiet murmurs of employees, some speaking among themselves, others turning to look at the boss with newfound defiance. The power had shifted, but what would happen next? Then, the unexpected happened. One of the employees, a soft-spoken person who had been with the company for years, spoke out with an unexpected clarity. "We're done being afraid. We've been putting up with this for too long, and it's time for a change. If you want to fire someone, it's not going to be her. It's going to be you. You can't keep treating us like this anymore." The boss's face twisted with anger, but the more he fumed, the more the employees began to gather around the woman who had started it all. It was no longer just her standing alone, it was all of them, standing together. "Enough," the boss spat, his voice shaking. "This is over. You'll all regret this." But his words felt hollow. They no longer carried the weight they once had. The employees stood their ground, and the boss realized, in that moment, that his authority had been undermined. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The room had been taken over by something more powerful, solidarity. In the following days, things began to unfold quickly. The tension that had been building for months, years, perhaps finally came to a head. Employees started to come together, not just in opposition to the boss, but in support of each other. The woman who had started it all became a symbol of resistance, not because of her defiance alone, but because of the way her courage had sparked a chain reaction. Some employees decided to file complaints with HR, while others quietly began searching for new opportunities, knowing that the toxic environment could no longer be tolerated. It wasn't just about one employee's firing anymore, it was about a system of unfairness, a broken culture, and a deep-rooted sense of inequality that had festered for too long. And with every passing day, the walls around the boss began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the company faced mounting pressure. Whispers of workplace injustice began to spread, not just among the employees, but also among clients and other industry professionals. Word had gotten out about the toxic environment, and the company's reputation, once untarnished, began to suffer. The boss, who had been so sure of his position, found himself increasingly isolated as his own team rallied against him. It wasn't long before the company board called an emergency meeting. The boss, once so confident in his unchallenged power, was confronted with the harsh reality of his actions. The employee's courage had forced the hand of the higher-ups. A few days later, the news spread, the boss was being removed from his position. The very person who had fired others without a second thought was now being held accountable. As the news circulated, there was a mix of relief and disbelief among the employees. The change wasn't immediate. There would be a lot of work to do to rebuild the broken culture and heal the wounds that had been inflicted over the years, but it was a start. The woman who had stood up in the face of adversity was not only reinstated but promoted to a higher position, one that gave her the power to help reshape the company from the inside out. In the months that followed, the company underwent a dramatic transformation. New leadership was put in place, leaders who listened to their employees, who valued their voices, and who worked to create a more inclusive, respectful, and fair environment. The changes weren't always easy, but they were necessary. The toxic culture that had once defined the company slowly faded into the past, replaced by one that prioritized teamwork, respect, and accountability. The employee who had stood her ground that fateful day became a beacon of hope for others. Her courage reminded everyone that standing up against injustice, no matter how big or small, could lead to change. And for the first time in a long time, the employees felt a sense of pride in their workplace. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. As for the boss, he disappeared from the company's history, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. The employees learned a powerful lesson: when they stood together, they could overcome even the most insurmountable odds. And in the end, it wasn't just about a job or a paycheck, it was about respect, fairness, and the strength to stand up for what was right. The story of that day, the day when everything changed, became a symbol of resilience. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult situations, when the odds seem impossible, standing up for what's right can lead to extraordinary results. It wasn't just one employee's victory, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or powerless. And that, in itself, was the most powerful takeaway of all.